The story of TNA has been revisited over the past week after 3 hours were dedicated to the beleaguered promotion on Vice TV's Dark Side of the Ring. Presented through the Jeff Jarrett lens as a story of a rising alternative in the exodus of WCW and ECW, the tale depicts a company on the upswing, but anchored by its fame-hungry owner who torpedoed the momentum and enlisted the help of self-serving individuals to spiral the company. To conclude after Jeff Jarrett and the battle for TNA that Jarrett equaled good and Dixie Carter bad is way too simplistic and charitable to Jarrett, who had his own flaws and missteps. Conversely, while Carter is an easy target, her family's angel investment was one of the many gifts from the heavens that benefited TNA. As a sacrifice due to time, several figures were omitted, including Bob Ryder, the former WCW employee and OneWrestling.com owner, was on the famous boat outing with Jeff and Jerry Jarrett when the idea was conceived and would be a fixture in TNA through its many ups and downs and into the Anthem era. He died in 2020 and had the distinction of being the promotion's first hire. Any practical assessment would see the flaws of TNA's business plan in 2002, with the idea of consumers spending $9.99 per week without any television support. The theory was that fans had been buying anywhere from 1 to 3 shows on a near monthly basis in the previous years, with extra cash to spend, with WWE all alone in the field. The early figures seemed too good to be true, mainly because programming executive Jay Hassman deceived Jeff and Jerry Jarrett with inflated pay-per-view figures. The Jarretts thought they had hit the jackpot, but reality struck cold, and they were performing well under Hassman's reported figures, and it resulted in a lawsuit accusing Hassman of fraud. Hassman was one detriment in the early months. The other was Richard Scrushy of Hell South, who made a handsome investment into the startup, only to face SEC charges of fraud and had to rescind his investment, nearly a fatal blow to TNA before the end of the summer.
Our exclusive interview with Richard Scrushy has a lot of people talking about the lives that were ruined because of the fraud scandal at Health South. Now, he was acquitted in that criminal case, but we have received a lot of comments on our Facebook page about people's thoughts on the Health South founder. Here are just 3 of them. No respect for the likes of him. He's no man. He should have served every day at hard labor. Also, no respect for the man or what he has to say. And this one's very tough. Scum of the earth. He's what's wrong with our capitalistic system. When you have your initials in your pool, the lake of fire awaits. Very tough words against Richard Scrushy. Now,
it was here that publicity hire Dixie Carter of Trifecta Entertainment would sell the concept of TNA to her parents, Bob and Janice Carter. The magnates of Panda Energy took majority control of the promotion, installing Dean Broadhead as its CFO and Jeff Jarrett as COO, with executive producer credit and a 29% stake in the new structure. Jerry would retain a minor ownership in the new plan. The U.S. wrestling scene was depressed. WWE was struggling to move beyond the Attitude Era and find its next crop of stars after Steve Austin's retirement, The Rock's exit from full-time wrestling, and a struggle in elevating babyface stars, while a dominant heel champion in Triple H took up so much programming. Bill Goldberg did not meet expectations for a variety of reasons, resulting in an uninspired year with WWE. Rob Van Dam was constantly cut off despite a heavy vote of confidence by the audience. Kurt Angle was plagued by ill-timed character turns mixed with his comedic presentation that led to an edge being lost. And Brock Lesnar had his fill of life on the road, opting to leave the company when he was one of the few stars to ascend. In 2004, WWE went with Chris Benoit and Eddie Guerrero as its respective champions, but neither panned out as long-term solutions, and it was a down period for the company. The next year, WrestleMania 21, was the launching pad of Dave Bautista and John Cena, and while not turning business completely around, the two helped get WWF out of its malaise of 2004. Cena would become the franchise star for the ensuing decades, but early on, it was Batista that caught fire, and Cena was the one who was the work in progress, with many believing Randy Orton was much more equipped for that top spot, but he presented too many liabilities outside of the ring, problems that Cena did not present. Batista became a ratings mover through his program with Triple H in the lead-up to WrestleMania, but after the coronation, they moved Cena to Raw and Batista to SmackDown, and it was a public declaration that Cena was the chosen one. TNA was struggling to gain ground, despite its new financial backing from Panda Energy. It was still limited to pay-per-view distribution and clinging to any names with a past in WWE, WCW, or ECW. Dark Side of the Ring focused on the emerging X Division and innovative ideas, but the shows were also plagued by inane ideas and a throw-anything-against-the-wall mentality.
I want to say, and to the old man who's sitting in the back with those headphones on his head, if you kill my mic, I'll come back there and I'll smack the shit out of you.
There was minimal cohesion mixed with isolated examples of a program that would actually stick. One was the well-done introduction of ex-WWE talent Raven and building toward an NWA championship match with Jeff Jarrett in April of 2003. The company needed television, but few were interested, forcing TNA to buy time on Fox Sports Net in 2004, obtaining a Friday afternoon time slot at a rate of $30,000 per week while continuing its weekly pay-per-views until September and then moving to the more traditional Sunday night model. While continuing its weekly pay-per-views until September and then moving to the traditional model of monthly pay-per-views. They hosted their first Sunday night pay-per-view in November with Victory Road, but again, relying on names from the past, incorporating Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, and even Randy Savage. It was a strategy that continued to frustrate audiences, where TNA lacked faith in its own product and ideas to succeed when it finally got a chance to present on a larger stage, and relying on other people's stars and resumes for the sake of Q ratings and preferring the past over the future. When the deal was up the next year, TNA opted against continuing with the expensive infomercial route on Fox Sports Net and was limited to running its weekly programming online despite presenting some of its strongest shows. In 2005, Scott D'Amore gained a more influential role, and TNA doubled down on its core stars with a steady diet of AJ Styles, Christopher Daniels, Samoa Joe, Petey Williams, and Chris Sabin. The next gift was WWE's split with Viacom in 2005, when cable partner Spike TV publicly disengaged from renegotiation talks and left WWE on the streets searching for a new home. Spike was in a position of leverage when WWE wanted a sizable markup in its programming fees due to the meteor that was the UFC arriving on their airwaves in January and siphoning a ton of the WWE Raw audience as its lead-in and becoming the new favored tenant at Spike. WWE would seek refuge, returning to the USA Network, but forking over all advertising to the network due to the position they were left with. Meanwhile, Spike wasn't out of the professional wrestling business, they were only out of the WWE business, and took a meeting with Dixie Carter and Jeff Jarrett. The result was a far smaller investment in TNA, placing them on Saturday nights at 11 p.m. Eastern beginning that fall, and TNA signing its most important deal to date. The fracturing of Jeff and Jerry Jarrett's relationship would occur in October, the same month they debuted on Spike, when fans clicking onto WWE.com saw an image of Jerry Jarrett alongside an unknown by the name of Oleg Prudius at WWE headquarters. The future Vladimir Kozlov had caught the attention of Jarrett, who set up a meeting with WWE and played right into the company's hand, causing an online stir, not to mention talent questioning if Jerry and Jeff would be leaving TNA and going to WWE. WWE knew exactly what it was doing, and you could say that TNA gained a level of revenge years later when WWE undercard wrestler Robbie McAllister showed up to watch an episode of Impact in Orlando and was shown on camera looking like he would be anywhere else but there. Unlike McAllister, Jerry Jarrett knew the game and appeared to have no reservations playing a pawn in this public gamesmanship, whereas McAllister was an innocent bystander making the mistake of trusting TNA to keep his appearance quiet. The fallout resulted in father and son not speaking for years, including Jerry missing the funeral of Jeff's spouse Jill in 2007. Thankfully, the two did patch up their differences years afterward before Jerry died 3 years ago. The Spike years were the most fruitful, yet divisive. They made it onto a major cable network, part of the same juggernaut that launched the UFC into a stratosphere, with a similar formula of building up personalities and rivalries and turning its television audience into pay-per-view purchasers. Immediately, TNA struck a deal with Jay Riso, aka Christian, who was deflated after a WWE run where he flirted with a top heel role against John Cena before being saddled as a secondary player on SmackDown. His deal was coming up, and he decided to move to TNA, legitimizing the operation in the eyes of many due to Christian's upward trajectory as opposed to someone living off past laurels.
And I didn't come here to see a grown man dressed up like a doctor pulling things out of another man's ass. Amen! And you can be damn sure I didn't come here because I got fired. He jumped!
Then came the signing of Sting to begin 2006 and placed into the role of active legend and one of the few WWE stars that had never ventured to WWE yet. A loyal and resilient audience continued to watch weekly programming, but the conversion from viewers to pay-per-view buyers was still a massive hurdle that TNA just could not clear. It led to further experimentation, changes in creative direction, and a constant push and pull between its identity as a WWE alternative and being WWE light. Its largest signing to date was revealed in September 2006 when TNA ended its no surrender card with the announcement of Kurt Angle's arrival. This was a bona fide WWE star whose exit was still clouded in mystery and placing a spotlight onto TNA. An acknowledgement of Angle's drug addiction was broached on Dark Side of the Ring, with Jarrett reflecting that the Olympic gold medalist had, quote, more bad days than good. Karen Angle was presented as his caretaker on the road, despite a quiet separation of the couple before formally joining TNA. WWE's release of Angle, less than a year after the death of Eddie Guerrero and the implementation of its wellness policy, showed just how concerned they must have been regarding Angle's problems. Was there an onus on TNA to take that factor into account? In a perfect world, yes. But in the wrestling business, a star is going to be given every benefit of the doubt, and heads are consistently buried in the sand when there's money to be made and problems to be ignored. The reality is, if it wasn't TNA, Angle very well may have found himself coaching on The Ultimate Fighter and fighting in the UFC, and would have been an equally, if not further flawed path for the issues that he was to battle. If not UFC, then Elite XC or the IFL or Wrestling in Japan would all be offers on the table. The company's big signing of Kurt Angle occurred the same week as Vince Russo's latest reunion with Jeff Jarrett and TNA, and it begged the question regarding Angle's effectiveness had he been brought in under a different creative staff. Angle immediately drew interest for his first match with Samoa Joe at the November Genesis pay-per-view, but they quickly engaged in follow-up matches, turned Angle heel, leaned on his comedy, and watered down the most effective version of Angle by presenting the sports entertainment prototype, preferring that version that stormed the ring with a milk truck than the wrestling machine, creating dream match scenarios such as the one with Samoa Joe. When they toyed with the formula for a memorable lead-up to Angle and Joe again for Lockdown in 2008, it was promoted like a UFC fight and ranked among its most successful shows ever, but did not take the lesson of what worked and apply it beyond that singular show. TNA continued to be a successful television entity and would be rewarded by going from Saturday nights to Thursdays and eventually expanding to 2 hours in prime time. This was the era where TNA reportedly reached profitability for the first and only time in its history, according to Jeff Jarrett. It was still the inferior product. A major signal was on February 16, 2007. WWE's Raw was preempted by the USA Network, airing on a Thursday head-to-head on TNA's own night against Impact. The result was Impact fell 47% in viewership from the week prior and identified that a sizable portion of the audience, when given the choice, were picking WWE over Impact. It was a source of frustration when TNA would draw the same 1.1 rating weekly, but not convince those people to buy a pay-per-view or buy a ticket. It was a stalemate, as those that were arguing about the ineffectiveness of pay-per-view could also defend by looking at the strong television numbers as a defense mechanism. And rather than decide on a concrete direction, everybody was placated and nothing would ever change. TNA was always after the next carrot being dangled, whether it be the next signing, a better night on television, expanded programming, new markets, new ideas, etc., etc. Yes, there was frustration among the fan base in real time, but it only expanded among viewers over the next decade. TNA was a Florida-based promotion, taping in front of locals on a soundstage in Orlando, signing various independent stars, giving them a television platform, opening up a women's division, presenting a style that the main roster of WWE was not. It was verbatim the blueprint that NXT would execute and latch its identity onto with a far greater success rate, although with corporate ownership that could bear sizable losses. TNA was not in a race to sign talent past their primes or water down its television or pretend it was 1998 and trying to go after lapsed fans. Instead, it had conviction that these quote-unquote indie stars would be the mainstream stars of the future and were committed to that vision. TNA had multiple years of a head start and a company in Panda that sunk millions and millions into investing. TNA was so busy identifying that they were something for everyone instead of identifying what they were not. It tried to be everything to its detriment. It wanted to be WWE. And as Vince Russo accurately points out in the Dark Side series, they could not compare to the level of production and major league feel that the industry leader commanded. While still profitable in 2009, everything goes to hell in the wake of Jeff Jarrett being sent home when Dixie Carter learns of his relationship with Karen. On the Dark Side series, it is retold as a power play by Dixie Carter, obsessed with ridding TNA of the Jarrett influence, and the co-founder loading the proverbial gun, handing it to Dixie, and orchestrating his own demise. The series begged for the perspective of Carter, who would not sit down with Vice, and it can be debated the merits of such a decision. On one hand, Carter is easily positioned as the naive villain of TNA's ruin during this era and left with no defenders. The other, Carter would have been grilled and greatly outnumbered by her detractors, mainly Jeff and Karen. Time will tell if Carter is motivated to present a counter to the claims that are levied in the series. There was an overhaul of the Jeff Jarrett regime, with Jeff being sent home and confidants such as Jim Cornette and Dutch Mantell sent packing. Vince Russo would usurp all of the power, but it would be short-lived as Carter navigated from Jarrett to the new toys, Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff. Now, when one makes a list of the top 10 most tumultuous periods in TNA history, Hogan and Bischoff and their arrival in 2010 at least ranks among the top 5.
The team of Hogan and Bischoff have done it before, and I'm damn well sure we can do it in TNA.
If you can't talk and you can't wrestle, pack your bags and head up north, because right now we're checking everybody out. And by the way, what you gonna do when TNA and all these maniacs become number 1 in the world just for you?
Like all bits of nostalgia, the first time hits strongest, and then it's diminishing returns. Such was the case on January 4th, 2010, when TNA received a 3-hour slot on Spike TV airing head-to-head with WWE Raw. While Bret Hart was stepping into a WWE ring for the first time in 13 years, Hulk Hogan was entering the Impact Zone, flanked by Eric Bischoff, Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, and Sean Waltman as Pro Wrestling transported to 1997 for the night. TNA drew a 1.5 rating and 2.2 million viewers for the Monday Night Experiment, which was enough to champion TNA for a permanent move to the new night beginning in March. The test was short-lived, as Impact lasted 9 weeks, airing against Raw before retreating to Thursdays. The die was cast from the implementation of a 4-sided ring from TNA's signature, demoting popular talents like Christopher Daniels, adding names from the past that range from the Nasty Boys to Val Venus and Orlando Jordan, and eating away at the core of the TNA brand. To any observer, it felt like a time warp, with the idea that Hogan possessed the magic wand that could take a promotion to the next level. This wasn't WCW, and it certainly wasn't 1994, with Hogan physically wrecked from a career of damage, limited to an authority role, living off a brand that they hoped would open doors. The Hogan image was about to endure a catastrophic hit in the ensuing years with the discovery of a sex tape involving his best friend's wife. The discovery of the tape coincided with a Hogan media tour, supposedly to promote Bound for Glory in 2012, but the sex tape dominated the discussion. Hogan was able to make light of the tape, but 3 years later, when the audio on the tape surfaced, the laughter stopped and Hogan's racist tirade would torpedo the once safe and wholesome persona. TNA never seemed content with the team they had on the field. It was always looking for the next hire. In the summer of 2010, Paul Heyman spoke openly of his negotiations to enter TNA and his plans to overhaul creative. It was contingent on multiple factors, from obtaining stock to Heyman demanding complete creative control of the roster and to cut off many of the legends and go with a youth movement.
TNA is looking to serve too many masters. And you have to have, in this industry, a long-range plan. TNA chases Thursdays. They chase those Friday morning overnights, and they sit there and they bite their fingernails waiting for those ratings to come in Friday at 4:00 in the afternoon. And they're never going to get anywhere doing that. They're just not. You have to have a 2, 3, 4 year plan. You have to be able to assess and say, listen, if we do a 1.5 rating this Thursday, it doesn't really matter. If we drop down to a 0.7, it doesn't really matter. Where are we going to be in 2 years? Let's write out where we want to be in 2 years. If I was a legend in TNA, I would not want Paul Heyman to walk in the door.
And by legend, you mean the older guys?
If you're over 40, I'd chop your fucking head off.
Really?
Yeah.
None of this would materialize, and Heyman would not enter TNA. In October of 2011, Vince Russo stepped down for the latest time at TNA. Bruce Pritchard, who was overseeing talent relations, would be named head of creative and was quick to hire David Lagana as director of creative writing to work alongside writer Matt Conway. Hogan would last longer than most optimists figured, staying with TNA through late 2013, but written off in one of the most embarrassing segments in company history. On the Vice series, Bischoff would take credit for conceiving the idea of owner Dixie Carter literally on her hands and knees begging Hogan to stay, clutching to his leg like a child refusing to be dropped off at daycare. Months later, Hogan was reunited with WWE, misidentifying stadium names, while TNA lulled itself into the latest next era. The departures did not stop there, as franchise star AJ Styles opted to explore his options elsewhere, citing the offer of a 60% reduction in pay to stay with TNA as his breaking point. It was the best career move for Styles, who was an immediate draw in the independent scene, forcing many to ask the question of why Styles meant more away from TNA than he did inside of the company, a testament to where the brand stood in the fans' eyes. He stormed into New Japan Pro Wrestling in 2014, immediately beating Kazuchika Okada for the IWGP Heavyweight Championship to kick off a nearly 2-year run with the company, upping his stock and then moving to WWE. Before 2013 was up, the company also ceased ties in an official capacity with Jeff Jarrett. The performer had played ball, going so far as to work a story out of the Kurt and Karen Angle situation, presenting Jeff on screen as the heel that stole Kurt's wife. To their credit, they could not have been more professional, and the storyline was one of the better pieces of business the company produced in 2011. But Jarrett was not resigned to the notion of strictly being a performer, and he made a play to acquire TNA through his ties with country musician Toby Keith. Talks lasted throughout the year, ultimately ending with the Carters unwilling to entertain a transaction that would involve Jarrett. Despite reports of Bob Carter insisting that Dixie be part of any spinoff, Jarrett has denied that element of the story, stating it never came up in the negotiations. With Jarrett iced out, he formally resigned from TNA in December of 2013. The defining story of 2014 was the company's loss of Spike TV, which was first reported in the summer. And despite obfuscation and damage control, TNA would leave the network at the end of the year. It was reported by Mike Johnson at PW Insider that TNA was seeking a sizable increase of roughly $26 million per year, with Spike countering with an offer in the $14 to $16 million range, which was largely confirmed by Spike president at the time, Kevin Kay, in the recent book Beyond Nitro, which was written by Guy Evans. Much was made of the revelation that year that Vince Russo was secretly rehired to assist in creative and work with the broadcasters. Spike did not want Russo involved, and therefore, Russo's rehiring was done under a veil of secrecy. Russo famously revealed his involvement in an errant email sent to Mike Johnson that was meant for Mike Tenay and thus blowing his cover. It will be denied that that was the straw that broke the camel's back, but at best, it was awful judgment for TNA to pull the wool over the eyes of its broadcast partner, having it publicly reported that they were working with Russo, and this directly lines up with the timing of Spike's decision to drop TNA. The real end of TNA's role as a national entity was that year and losing Spike TV and the rights fees that accompanied it. Some of the messaging was laughable, such as Dixie Carter appearing on Steve Austin's podcast and presenting it as TNA making the call to leave Spike TV instead of being shown the door.
And, it was just time for us to try something different. And, Discovery has been a great partner in a very short period of time. People look at our numbers and they're saying, they're not doing anywhere close to Spike. Well, first of all, it was a conscious decision. I talked to the talent, they wanted to be someplace that, where they felt like there was going to be more of an investment in our brand and growing us, et cetera. And we all agreed, that taking sometimes a step back to take a step forward is important. And Destination America is one of the top 5 fastest growing cable networks on TV. We felt like if we could go in there and be a hit for them, which we are, that we could grow together. And the Discovery family has been fantastic in supporting us.
They landed on a cable outlet called Destination America, prompting TNA fans to figure out what the hell Destination America was. It was slotted on Friday nights, then moved to Wednesday nights within 6 months, and the company didn't even have exclusivity, not just on the network, but even on the night, seeing Ring of Honor added to the Wednesday night lineup along with Impact. TNA was still attracting in the range of 1 million viewers at the end of their Spike TV run. That would be cut in half by the start of Destination America's run and would scale downward, generating under 300,000 viewers by the end of the deal. Next up was Pop TV, the former TV Guide network, and moving to Tuesday nights, followed by a shift to Thursday nights. And now TNA had aired Impact on every single night of the week, save for Sundays. The next round of life support occurred throughout 2016 as a battle for control of the company emerged and its finances became dangerously low. Stories of production members being late on pay, concern over whether shows would be delivered to broadcasters on time, talent departures, and overall destruction of morale became its only headlines. Billy Corgan came on board with the hope of eventually securing the company. With TNA deeper in debt, Anthem Sports and Entertainment began to assist in financing the company. Anthem was the parent company of TNA's Canadian broadcaster, the Fight Network, and had a vested interest in preserving the brand and, in time, taking ownership of its remnants. A protracted legal battle with Billy Corgan for the company left Corgan on the outs and played out publicly as onlookers questioned how this company could find additional life and funding. Open heart surgery was performed on the executive side, with the remnants of TNA falling under the umbrella of Impact Ventures, which was then changed to Anthem Wrestling Exhibitions. The company itself would rebrand to Impact Wrestling. An owl was introduced, and Anthem executive Ed Nordholm would take the reins of this cash-strapped quagmire. And what was Anthem's first major move? Why, bringing back Jeff Jarrett, of course, in an executive capacity to help raise the problem child that was TNA. How could this get more complicated? Well, in the interim, between Jeff Jarrett's TNA tenures, he launched Global Force Wrestling. And rather than sunset one project for the next, couldn't all companies coexist together? The answer was an affirmative no, but they tried anyway. The shift to the Owl era was hampered further by an ugly public spat involving the Hardys over the ownership of the Broken Universe characters. The novelty of Broken Matt Hardy and Brother Nero was one of the few success stories that TNA latched onto in 2016, highlighted by an episode of Impact dubbed The Final Deletion. With the Hardys exiting the company in early 2017, a short stop at Ring of Honor, which acted as a bridge for a full-fledged Hardys reunion in WWE. But Anthem contended that the characters and IP were their property, forcing the Hardys to leave their concepts behind. It did no favors for TNA, as they were the butt of many jokes, and the stream of negative headlines further diminished the brand into a laughingstock. A resolution was finally reached, and a photo was shared of Matt Hardy and Ed Nordholm to end the standoff. Jarrett's path back to a position of influence was short-lived. Plagued by drinking problems that transferred from private to public settings, it became impossible to ignore that Jarrett required help. A breaking point was his appearance on screen at Triple Mania 25, where he appeared in no condition to be performing. Jarrett was sent to outpatient treatment by Anthem, but relapsed on a flight to Alberta and was forced to resign from the company. Jarrett outlined his recovery in the Dark Side series, spending 56 days in rehab and getting those issues addressed. It can be fair to say that 2017 was a complete write-off, but by year's end, Nordholm relied on Scott D'Amore and Don Callis as his wrestling people to get this ship pointed into the right direction. It was here that slowly the company got some of the right pieces in place, utilizing talent such as LAX, Ray Phoenix, and Pentagon Jr. D'Amore would reflect on this period, where its image was in the trash and life-saving measures were required for the brand. One of the major unsung heroes of TNA opted out of the next phase of the company. Jeremy Borash's teenage and adult years were consumed by radio, television, and professional wrestling. He started broadcasting at 15, was a program director at 19, and hired by WCW to host the innovative WCW Live internet streaming show. Throughout his career, he demonstrated a demeanor of saying yes to whatever was thrown his way and learning on the job to handle anything from broadcasting, writing, hosting, editing, promotions, and anything that fell through the cracks. It was easy to see why Jarrett saw Borash as an asset and one of the promotion's first hires. Over his tenure, he performed every job under the sun in TNA, initiating the British Boot Camp reality series, steering TNA toward the UK market, which had untapped levels of potential for the company when it was struggling to find the same response stateside. He was also instrumental in the development of the Broken Universe, and it wasn't going unnoticed by WWE. So when the news broke in January 2018 that Borash was leaving, it was a gut punch to the diehard TNA disciple that a day one lifer was choosing greener pastures. Borash would move upward, landing in NXT as part of Paul Levesque's team he was assembling for the future. Today, he holds a major position in the AAA brand acquired by WWE in 2025. TNA would go from Pop TV for the Pursuit channel in 2019, followed by a shift to Access TV by year's end, which Anthem had just acquired a majority stake of. It was a struggle for the average viewer to keep up with the changing network homes, but worse, TNA had fallen amid a surge of readily available weekly pro wrestling. By 2019, AEW had emerged with a viable deal on TNT, New Japan Pro Wrestling was still a strong entity, SmackDown was moving to network television, and Raw was still a 3-hour weekly fixture. Just having a television outlet was not enough. You had to convince your audience that their time was being rewarded with quality among a sea of options. It was a laneway TNA had all to themselves for the better part of a decade. Now, all the talented performers of the mid-2000s who were deemed too small, too acrobatic, not great promos, not household names, and will never draw, were now becoming the secret sauce of the updated style and presentation, with many graduates of TNA and ROH ascending to the apex of the business. TNA had so many advantages, a strong cable backer and loads of investment money, but did not capitalize, forcing themselves back to square one on too many occasions and a fan base so tired of the missed opportunities. Access TV was the latest carrot dangled, representing a larger platform than Pursuit, but in time wasn't the difference maker either. Callis departed TNA and went to work for AEW in 2021. D'Amore handled the wrestling side until early 2024 when he was let go despite an uptick in popularity. D'Amore oversaw the latest bold move, reviving the TNA branding at the start of the year and opening dialogue with WWE, highlighted by knockouts Mickie James and Jordynne Grace appearing at Royal Rumble matches. D'Amore represented one of the last connective tissues to the earliest era of the company, and with his removal was yet another blow to any slow developing momentum. However, an unlikely alliance with WWE matured into a full-fledged working agreement and crossover appearances with NXT, allowing TNA to showcase its talent and vice versa. It pivoted from the D'Amore era to the newly added executive Carlos Silva installing his team to oversee operations. This past January, the carrot dangled was a larger television platform, and they moved from Access TV to AMC. They launched with a universally panned episode that many left questioning what the direction of this version of TNA would be. The crossover with NXT has dried up and feels like a relationship that merely exists now as a press release, with Channing Stacks Lorenzo and Ariana Grace as the only remnants of NXT talent appearing on TNA programming. TNA talents Jordynne Grace and Joe Hendry have moved to WWE full-time, with Mike Santana expected to follow. It overhauled its creative direction recently by removing Tommy Dreamer to steer in a different direction, but defining that direction remains the tougher task. What is TNA's role in the current environment? Is Anthem as dedicated to the brand after a decade of running a wrestling promotion? There are always so many overarching questions, and somehow TNA finds a suitable answer to dodge one question before being faced with the next. When the autopsy is eventually performed, the damage inflicted by TNA itself would be enough to kill most companies several times over. They have been beneficiaries of miraculous luck, timing, and funding at the most opportune times and remain standing after 24 years of operation. It is a far cry from the weekly Wednesday night operation at the Nashville Fairgrounds or the alternative that Jeff Jarrett envisioned. It has had many stewards, countless TV partners, and too many eras to recollect. From Dixie Carter to Jeff Jarrett, Vince Russo, Billy Corgan, Scott D'Amore, Ed Nordholm, Anthony Ciccione, and Carlos Silva all have played a role in steering this ship. The map is impossible to read, the destination is based on feel, and the journey has never been smooth. But it continues onward in search of that next carrot that is always within reach, but never in its grasp.